It is Thursday, October 16th. There's a lot to cover weather-wise in this video. I want to go through a ton of stuff. I want to talk about the severe weather setup on Saturday. We have this low pressure system currently spinning kind of over Salt Lake City right now. I had a few wind reports from there yesterday. That's going to transition into kind of that kicker wave that we talked about, producing that potential severe setup on Saturday, but also a lot of rainfall in the forecast for an area that has had drought build in over the last 6 to 7, 8 weeks now across the Central Corn Belt. Then I'm going to focus on the Central Corn Belt again because that forecast has shifted even like early next week with another one of these, again, kicker waves that I've been talking about. We talked about that possibility on Tuesday. We were kind of peering out into the forecast next week. I also want to transition this discussion into where we're going with respect to temperatures. That's changed a little bit in the long range, but then ultimately near the end of this video, I've saved a ton of slides for the winter forecast. Eric did a good job kind of touching on things we're watching in the winter forecast, even as it like implicates next growing seasons, moisture for the planting window and beyond, maybe heading toward an El Nino potentially. I want to focus more so just on winter, comparing some past years with some changes that we're seeing in the Pacific now and some things at least we can watch for as we like change this month from October to November and then critically like November to December. What will we be looking for that's going to change or shift our thinking in that forecast? I'm going to do that thing that Eric and I are really good at where I show you like a ton of slides on winter and then fail to give you a firm forecast at the end of it. I'll just spoil that now, that much like what he said yesterday, you're not going to hear a firm answer from me, but at least I promise I'll give you a few things that we're going to be watching for and that we'll be tracking over the next 6 weeks, if you will. That's going to take me a long time. I hope I get through it. I have coffee in front of me here this morning, but if you watch this later in the afternoon, I don't know, grab popcorn or something. It's going to be right. All right, if we start out this morning, I started with the infrared view rather than the radar precipitation across the continental U.S., and I actually blew it up a little bit. So I think much of the 7-day forecast, you can actually kind of see starting to take shape or unfold here, if you will. I'm going to start with the actual product. And what I mean by that is this is an infrared satellite view of North America. You can see both oceans are on the east and west coast. What I mean by that is we're looking at sensible heat, infrared radiation coming back and being absorbed by the satellite here, which is giving us this reading. Now, the color bar is reversed on the right here. So what I mean by that is the brighter colors are colder on this animation. And so we have the cold cloud tops from this low pressure system spinning, producing the moisture and showers across the northern plains. Saw that fall over the last 24 hours, some light showers there. But I'm actually not looking at the cloud tops here this morning. My focus is on the cold ground that's being picked up by this infrared satellite. And so this like white color here right before it transitions into like more of the cloud brightness colors is very cold ground. And you actually see this like freezing ground temperature up in the Sierra Nevadas from all the snowfall, the anomalous kind of early water year snowfall that Eric talked about yesterday that we had accumulate in the Sierra Nevadas, particularly the southern Sierras that needs that snowpack going into this water year. We can also see, cool ground, some of it even near freezing here across generally the west. Like I'm going to just draw all the areas that are definitely on the cooler side just on this infrared satellite imagery. So without even looking at a temperature observation this morning, at least with respect to this forecast, like you can tell we're colder here and then we warm up east of the continental divide. Look at these darker colors on infrared. That's warmer ground, i.e. probably warmer air helping to produce that. So cold here, warm here. There's our trough in the upper atmosphere. We're just kind of putting this all together here. That's helping to produce this low pressure system. And you can kind of see it's on its way that way. You have all this warm, relatively moist air starting to stream in, helping to produce those showers. And then, what else are we seeing here? Well, if we go over to like the Finger Lakes, the eastern Great Lakes, notice we're colder here too. Like if I just compare the ground cover here to here, we're cooler on this side versus this side, even up into like, if we peer through the clouds here, like South Dakota's warmer than New York, at least with respect to this color bar and the ground temperature. So we're warm in the middle, we're cooler on the, let's call it the west and east flank. And that is our setup. We have a trough here and we have a trough here. This one's going to be moving this way. This low pressure system is going to be amplifying up into the northern plains, actually heading more so up into Canada. And then the final piece of this that really takes us into like a 5 to 7 day forecast is this coming on screen now. A lot of that Pacific momentum careening in, a lot of rainfall expected for British Columbia. And this has to go somewhere. It's going to be piling in to the continental U.S. This is going to be our kicker wave, this momentum out of the Pacific jet stream. It's going to meet up with this trough that we're seeing here. And instead of all of this kind of activity just racing off into Canada and being done with it, it's going to help produce another low that's going to climb through here at the end of this week here. And by Saturday, very quickly, this is all going to occur because of how much momentum is coming out of the Pacific, produce our low pressure system somewhere here over the central Corn Belt. That's going to move toward the northeast, bringing a severe threat. That's kind of putting it all together, just looking at the infrared satellite here this morning. All right, let's put this into practice. Where are our current temperatures today? Let's update this about the recording, 540. All right, there's our freezing to colder temperatures in the west. There's our cooler temperatures over the Great Lakes that we figured out from the infrared, and there's the warmth in between all the way up to South Dakota. So that's just kind of putting it together. We didn't even need the observations this morning, just looking at the infrared satellite imagery. All right, the next piece of this was that low was going to race up to the northeast, and then we had that kicker wave coming in behind it. That was going to help kick off another low in this area. So we would expect, decent precipitation through that corridor here, and maybe through a corridor like that. So we jump over and look at the 7-day precipitation forecast just from the WPC, the National Weather Service. We did pretty well. There's that British Columbia precip. I mentioned that one first. Look at the temperate rainforest getting up there into British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. All the rainfall expected there, even getting into the Willamette Valley, the Seattle-Tacoma area, up near an inch of rainfall. Much higher in the mountainous regions. That initial low that races off into Canada. You can see that there. And then that second one developing somewhere near the kind of Arkansas state line. Appreciable precipitation amounts over an area that really needs the moisture, especially for a lot of these like post-harvest applications in this area here, before we get down to like totally freezing later in December. So that's kind of putting it together quickly in the 7 days. We're going to dive into the details of this in just a second, but I wanted to start with that full picture of where this pattern is going. Now, quickly, areas missing out, the southeast, we're worried about drought development, and then in the southern plains, we'll see where this dividing line is. Unfortunately, some of the precipitation forecast values starting to come down a bit for this area here, and drought starting to swell is a concern there. If we just look over the last 24 hours of precipitation, you can see those light showers that have moved through the plains, even into the Corn Belt. Some of these maybe even a little bit stronger than expected, but we're not talking about significant rainfall amounts, save for just some isolated areas, maybe near like the Black Hills and over in the Four Corners region. I mentioned that severe report or two we had near Salt Lake. And if you really want to see this all come together, Eric did a great job showing this yesterday, is the 500 millibar heights and vorticity. If you really want to kind of track what's happening in the atmosphere from like a 7 to 10 day perspective, this is the sort of forecast map or product I always start with, just as a meteorologist, helps you put together where these little vortmaxes are, these little features that often tie together to produce our big low pressure systems and drive our big weather events, especially what we're talking about like on Saturday. If we look here this morning, Thursday, valid about 7 a.m. Central Time, near the recording of this video, there's that Salt Lake low. Called it there. That's where you saw the most vigorous convection and precipitation right around the center of this vorticity maximum here. There's another lobe here that we'll have to keep an eye on. You can see the one responsible for that northeastern trough off to the east. So take this forecast in through this evening. See that moving up through the Dakotas, bringing that rainfall there. Moves up into Manitoba after that, and then here comes that momentum out of the Pacific that we talked about. This other piece sneaking through the Four Corners that I just mentioned earlier. As we get through Friday into Saturday, that first lows all the way out of the picture up into Canada, or at least nearing it in Manitoba. Here comes that next Pacific kicker wave, and then that little lobe or that other vortmax that got left behind. In fact, let's watch these back in time. It's going to be kind of neat to see these. We'll go all the way back. They were, buddies. They were pals near one another in the Intermountain West. And just because of how they flung around one another, this piece gets left behind near Flagstaff, takes a vacation through the panhandle of Texas, and it's going to meet up critically with that Pacific momentum that we saw come up and over the Colorado and Canadian Rockies. That's going to come out onto the elevation, or off the elevation, I should say, into the central and southern plains. It's going to meet up, and as it does, somewhere in here, it's going to help kick off that next low pressure system, which is why that dividing line of precip was like right here. And as it does that, it's going to help produce a brand new low pressure system. See them meeting up now. Look at how much energy is coming through here. Producing a very deep low pressure system. This is all the way now Saturday night into Sunday morning. That's going to be racing off through the eastern Corn Belt. Now, kind of critically as it relates to the severe forecast, anytime we get an amplifying low, kind of in the risk area, if you will, on Saturday evening, that always heightens my concern a little bit for the severe weather potential. It's just as you're ramping up, you're bringing more ingredients together, you're increasing the dynamics of the system necessarily, and that tends to produce more favorable weather for these severe setups and severe thunderstorms, all else equal. So the concern is still there for a severe weather event. And we'll kind of watch this take shape on the ECMWF precipitation forecast here. I'll start this here Thursday morning. Our vortmax is somewhere here, helping to produce that snowfall over the Intermountain West. Our low pressure system starting to consolidate here over South Dakota. Go quite a bit of precipitation here for North Dakota and South Dakota here this morning, and I didn't even show it, right? We were looking at infrared, but we'll go look quickly at that composite precip here this morning. See how close the ECMWF got it. There it is. There's all those showers that we just saw from the ECMWF being forecast. There they are on radar as they're recording this video. Low pressure system trying to develop somewhere in here. Some of those snow showers that were populated there. Let's jump back. So I can find my place. And we'll take this forecast out into this evening. See additional precipitation spreading across the northern plains, even into Wisconsin, like western Ontario here, through this evening, and then into Friday afternoon. That low moving up into Canada, not seeing as much snow on the backside of it as we initially thought. Leaves a weak low cold front, I should say, through the Corn Belt. This is now Saturday, very early Saturday morning, waiting on that next kicker wave. Cold front starts to, we talked about this on Tuesday, starts to kind of strangely increase in precipitation coverage. That's not always a usual evolution. It's because that kicker wave's coming in behind it. This is now 1 p.m. Saturday, and you start to see some sort of surface low forming. This time near Oklahoma City, it's 1,006 millibars, so not deep yet. Wouldn't really call it a low on this map. But precipitation coverage starts to increase very quickly by 7 p.m. On Saturday, there's going to be a low somewhere, in here. You could call it here, maybe down here. And this is those two waves coming together on Saturday. So the system's going to be ramping up as we go through Saturday PM. And then there it is. Very obvious low now, somewhere near like Kokomo, Indiana. And heavy rain and thunderstorms falling in this corridor here. See, high values, high confidence and heavy precipitation in that area here. If you remember, the WPC forecast had some of the highest values in through that area for that reason. We take the forecast through Sunday morning. That low ramping all the way up into Ontario, heavy rain stretching all the way down through Atlanta, through the eastern Corn Belt, again, an area that needs it, West Virginia. All the drought that we've been seeing there, the drought we've been seeing in Missouri, pushing through Pennsylvania, New York, early Monday morning. That low is still going, wrapping up near Boston by very early Tuesday morning. Now we have another low coming through again, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. There's that cold front. And this one even has a little kicker behind it, which is going to allow that cold front to produce a little bit more precipitation through the central Corn Belt, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, than initially expected, even into like Pennsylvania. And that takes us all the way out through Thursday of next week. We're finally maybe getting like a warmer break in behind this system. Now, I want to touch on temperatures quickly before I talk about the precipitation anomalies. Over the next 5 days, with those that low initially coming through, we're warm out ahead of it, so it makes sense to see a lot of that warmth in the central and eastern part of the country. The far east kind of coast still under the influence of that trough that's moving offshore, but by and large warmer across maybe the eastern 2/3 of the country. As that next system comes through, behind it early next week, will be cooler on the backside of those two systems, but generally starting to warm up on the backside as those come through. That was kind of late next week that we talked about, even getting out to like late next weekend. But still, if you look at any of the 9 panels here, I don't see a lot of cold air to be thrown into the central U.S. So what we maybe thought near the end of October, we could see, our first big cold spell, right, with frost freeze advisories all the way through like the Corn Belt or into the Ohio River Valley or even like the Southern Plains. We're just not seeing that right now. The only model, chiclet or card here that I could say has enough cold air to do that is all the way at the end of the AIFS, where we get a lot of freezing air built up into the Canadian prairie and the western U.S. that you could then, in the future, potentially, spill out into the U.S. So without a lot of that cold air right now, despite these lows coming through and despite the cold fronts that are pushing through, potentially 2 of them through the central and eastern part of the country over the next, let's call it 6 to 7 days, not a ton of cold air behind it. Maybe seasonal to slightly cooler. We'll have to see late next week. Temperatures probably getting down into the 40s, maybe high 30s for some of these areas that I'm highlighting here. I know it's small on the map. I apologize. All right, I'm going to double back to Saturday quickly. Actually, before I do that, let's look at the 7-day precip anomalies from the ECMWF. So we just walked through this forecast with respect to the kind of precipitation day by day. There's that initial low moving up into Canada and the Dakotas, that rain falling now in a lot of those areas. As that kicker sets up somewhere here, you can see the rain values increasing across the Mid-South and all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Through the eastern Corn Belt, certainly through the central Corn Belt, before that races up into Ontario, and then through New England as well. There's that second system coming through 4 to 10 days. Remember, initially coming across this way, it looked a bit weak as it wrapped up initially, but then that little kicker came through and amplified the cold front for this corridor here, and that kind of lingered, remember, through Michigan before pushing off through New England. So not bone dry, in this corridor here. You can see some certainly drier contours here. I think we get some rainfall through this area, but certainly as you go south of there, back through the southern Mississippi Valley into the southern plains, we're seeing that dryness take hold as we get out into next week, with that much of that low track staying much further north than the current one this week. Now, Saturday specifically, I pulled up the dew point and the surface winds. This is from earth.nullschool.net. We often pick this one up to showcase the moisture return or the Bermuda high. If we just do that here, let's put a very simple forecast together. Where do we have the best return flow or the moisture source out of the Gulf? Well, let's just kind of follow it here. I have plotted on here, the colors are dew points. That's that critical moisture that we need for severe weather. And you can kind of see it. If I draw the best moisture return out of this, I'm just going to follow these trend lines, or the stream lines, I should say. I'm just going to follow them. You can kind of see them getting funneled through western Louisiana here. I know the state lines aren't on here. I apologize. All right, now we're kind of getting funneled up into here. And you see there's another kind of moisture convergence here in the Appalachians, southern Missouri. Here's the Missouri River. That kind of helps us figure out that we're in Missouri now. All right, so I see nice wedge here of moisture convergence, the state line of Missouri into northern or central Arkansas. This corridor here has that best moisture return. Here's our cold front. That's going to be the kicker for the storms. And then some additional moisture return up into southern Illinois. So I'm that corridor here, you can see some of the higher values of the dew point getting here and here to East Texas, maybe up into here. So you can see that kind of collision that's likely to occur on Saturday. This is actually Saturday evening, now 5 to 6 p.m. If we jump over and look at 850 millibar winds, I'm going to zoom this in, make this. So this is looking at that low-level wind shear that we often look at for severe weather, particularly tornadoes, sometimes wind as well. If we look at Saturday afternoon, it's not particularly high here, forecasted from the ECMWF. But as we get into the evening, we notice this on that vorticity forecast, that it was kind of a late phasing as it relates to the time of day. It kind of took later into the day for those two vorticity maximums to come together. It's almost well into Saturday evening. And we see that here from the ECMWF forecast for those low-level winds, that they don't really wrap up until we get out toward 7 p.m. in the evening. And so that's why this kind of low-level shear doesn't really ramp up into the Boot Heel, Missouri, northeastern Arkansas, southern Illinois until later. So again, I'm kind of painting a risk area. I mentioned central Arkansas. We saw a lot of that flow getting into this area here. If the highest severe risk were to be any area, I'd kind of put it in here, maybe even increasing a little bit later in the evening in that quarter here. So something like that. And if we jump over to the Storm Prediction Center, their area of slight risk now for Saturday looks pretty similar. They're stretching it a little bit further south along that front. Saying, all right, we might get some additional storm development down here. This is going to update because I'm only looking at one forecast run from the ECMWF right now. I haven't shown you the GFS. Actually, the NAM is starting to take us all the way out there as well. I'm not going to dive through every single model run right now. I think the big picture here that the SPC gets correct is there's a wide area here of potential severe concern, which isn't always the case, as we're going through mid to late October at this point. And some area in here could be upgraded to maybe an enhanced risk as we go through the evening on Saturday. Now, long-term with respect to the forecast, as we get closer to Halloween, Eric and I have been talking about this narrative as the momentum has come up out of the Pacific. We're seeing that in the forecast here with these kicker waves, so to speak. Well, our latest forecast runs of that momentum, atmospheric angular momentum, they're still increasing all the way out into the new month of November. Maybe falling off a little bit after that if we're going to believe some of these maybe longer range models, but by and large still much improved momentum from where we sat earlier in October. So expecting more of these low pressure systems to come through, more inclement weather to talk about. We can kind of see this if we just look at the long range forecast, do the four cards that we always look at, ECMWF ensemble, AIFS, and the GFS ensemble, with more activity for the southern plains, fortunately, at least parts of it, into the panhandle of Texas. The AIFS going much wetter for the central corn belt, out in through the 24th through the 30th, kind of the Halloween week eve. And then, man, look at the Pacific Northwest. What is going on here? That is our East Asian Mountain Torque. We talked about it last week. It is getting underway now. It's going to extend that Pacific jet stream. And it seems to be targeting, at least in almost all of these long-range forecasts, the Climate Prediction Center now picking up on it, on the Pacific Northwest for a potential atmospheric river event. I've taken this Earth.null school view of that jet stream level wind, and I've taken this forecast out through, let's see, that would be Monday of next week, so 10/20. And if you kind of like click in here at some of the values, we're talking like a 200 mile an hour jet streak aloft. So this is an impressive beginning to that Pacific jet extension as we get out into early next week. Let's go ahead and follow that from the ECMWF AIFS forecast from the North Pacific. You can make this bigger. There we go, a little bit bigger. Can I make it? Yeah, there we go. That works. All right, I'm going to take this to 10/20. I said do it Monday. There's that jet streak across the North Pacific. Let's follow this as it makes its way across. Okay, now it's north of Hawaii here. Man, it's still going, maybe even a little bit stronger here off of Hokkaido in Japan. And this is now Wednesday of next week. That is impressive. This is all the way Saturday of next week, pointing a big trough right at the Pacific Northwest, all the way out till next weekend. Now, Big Ridge downstream of that, potentially quite a bit of warmth. We saw that in the long-range forecast, right? We were asking, where's the cold air? Wasn't there in a lot of those long-range forecasts, including the AIFS, but 967 low near British Columbia. This would bring a lot of rainfall to this region here. Don't think the AFS has like a PWAT, but I mean, yeah, didn't even need to look at that to tell you this area is going to go crazy wet if this forecast holds. Now, this is a very long-range forecast, but there's a lot of support for it, right? We were even kind of able to start picking up on this potential last week. And critically, again, we're way out now, 300 hours in the forecast. This is not like verbatim. But if that dives out into a trough with all that momentum coming in behind it into the central part of the country, I mean, it makes sense, right? Where you're getting a much more wet, active forecast for the central U.S., getting out toward that Halloween week. So seeing where this is going, this is going to be interesting. It's going to be fun to follow in a sense with respect to the forecast, but there's still a lot that can change. But the potential is there, the support's there for a more active pattern going through the end of the month. All right, I promised at the beginning of this video I would maybe touch on the tropics. I don't know if I remember if I covered that or not. Let's see where I'm at with time. We'll see how quickly we can get this done. We are watching one Atlantic wave. This is way over in the central Atlantic. It's actually very far south. And what I mean by that, usually we're watching the waves kind of meander over this way, maybe come toward the northern side of the Lesser Antilles before racing up. I mean, how many storms have we talked about this year that do something more like that? This one much further south. And the expectation as we go through the next few days, even into this weekend, like Sunday, Monday, is this could sneak into the southern kind of Caribbean Sea here. And that's an interesting area. I often call this area the Southern Caribbean death zone because it's not necessarily always favorable for hurricanes. It can get more favorable later in the year. This is an area where the trade winds typically slow down. They're really fast through here. They slow down here, and that kind of quick to slow motion produces kind of a natural high sometimes in this area here, which can help to squash tropical development. However, as much as I say that, we're kind of later in the year, all the way at the end of October. If you can get a system in here, it starts to organize a lot of the forecasts, and this is often the case in here, very little shear. A lot of the shear from those East Pacific storms has been like over this area here, either in the Gulf or the Northern Caribbean. So if we can get into here and maintain organization despite the trade winds or whatever, some of these storms can be a problem. And I say that because there's the best track to get like a storm up into the U.S. without hitting any land is technically there's only two. One is okay, scrape along all these islands of the Caribbean, and then we're going into South Carolina or Miami, because the Bahamas don't count much for land as far as hurricanes are concerned. The other one is the southern track where you're coming all the way up, and then you sneak through the Yucatan in that channel there. And one way I can kind of visualize this, if we look at all the Atlantic Cat 5s that have ever occurred, you're going to see these kind of two corridors show up a little bit. So these are all the Atlantic hurricanes that reach Cat 5 status at one point, and you'll notice there's not a lot, around the Greater Antilles because of all that land here. So there's a lot that kind of take this track, and then there's this other sneaky, all right, we're going to stay way south. We're going to sneak into the Caribbean where there's very low shear, and that's why you see all the purple dots. Those are all Cat 5. At this time it was a Cat 5 in the history. So if it can get into here, there's a lot of potential because there's no way to get out of here without hitting something. Mexico, Cuba, Jamaica, Central America, etc. So we got to keep an eye on it if it gets all the way out into here. That's going to be all the way next week. That's not to say this is even going to get into the Southern Caribbean as a defined system, but it's something we're going to have to keep our eye on. I've seen a lot of like people on social media posting about like the long-range GFS forecast where this blows up into some big hurricane that becomes something. It's too early to talk about anything like that, but we'll have to keep our eye on it as we go through next week. We should know more by like Sunday or Monday. All right, I promised I would do a deep dive and show you a bunch of slides in this winter. I'm going to do that now. Before I get into that, let's see if I can get my slides set up. Here we go. I'm going to do a quick recap of last winter. And we're just going to start with December through February precipitation departures from average. Now, the flow last winter, I'm just going to draw it quickly, frankly, did something like this. Went like that, and then it dove down like that. And so we had generally convergence here. We had plenty of flow for parts of the Pacific Northwest, particularly Northern California, Oregon, Idaho, Western Montana, with all that flow. And then as it dives down, as we move toward the south, that's convergent flow in the upper atmosphere. So we had a lack of precipitation here. Then it ended up meeting with a front as that flow turned and came back. And that's why we had excess precipitation in the mid-south, kind of Tennessee Valley over toward Arkansas, and the southern Mississippi Valley. Kind of dry outside of that, however. So dry where we were missing that flow. Now, that ended up with a snow drought in this area here across the north. If we jump over and look at what that snowfall looked like, it was this kind of impressive snow drought between Minneapolis, Chicago, all the way west through Sioux Falls and the Black Hills. And then we were anomalously snowy through the south with the ridiculous once-in-a-lifetime snow event along the Gulf Coast. With respect to temperatures, well, okay, we had that jet stream coming in like that, generally seasonal to cooler north of that, diving down through this area here, cooler with those cold shots of air that came through the mid-south last year. There was a bit of kind of a split flow at times, which left this area dry and a little bit more seasonal, even a little bit warmer in some of these climate districts here. So that was the general kind of theme of last winter. And if we sum this all up with the composite 500 millibar height anomalies with the trough ridge pattern, jet stream flow north of Hawaii, plenty of it with the trough here, moving north through the Pacific Northwest, and then diving down through the eastern U.S., kind of what we talked about. Much cooler aloft here, so much more troughiness here over the eastern Great Lakes, portions of eastern Canada. And that's what helped to produce all that kind of cold air that did sit here for a time, helped to give you that crazy lake effect season in some of these areas here, particularly over in the eastern Great Lakes, but also near Lake Superior and northern Lake Michigan. So that's why we had a lot of that, despite snow drought all around it outside of lake effect snow. Now, last year, our sea surface temperatures looked very similar to where they're at now, which is why I bring up last winter. Last winter is a great analog for where we're at right now. We had a relatively weak La Nina, but it was definitely a La Nina. We had a lot of warmth in the North Pacific. But one difference is we were quite a bit cooler in the North Pacific, at least by December 1st. There is time for us to recreate this year. If the next 45 days see a lot of disturbances come through here, which, by the way, in that long-range forecast, we saw a 967 millibar low in here. That would certainly help to stir up the waters up well then and make them cooler in this region here. So while it is a difference right now, there's time to make up for it. And so there's a decent analog this year for last year. That's something we've already talked about. Now, one kind of curious case is winter of 22 into 23. Now, I bring this one up because it was a La Nina winter that the West received a ton of rainfall. And this was when we had a lot of these like deep atmospheric river events come all the way through California. We had like lightning and thunder in San Francisco, a ton of snowfall for the Sierra Nevadas. We were much cooler west, we were warmer east, and it was a very kind of odd La Nina. Strangely enough, if we compare that to last year or this year, where we have a weak La Nina, that year was a much stronger La Nina. You can just see how much more cold water was here. And so the composite pattern, that 500 millibar height pattern with very little temperature contrast between the equator and the poles, which helped to drive that jet stream. The jet stream was very undulating, if you will, extremely variable, even with respect to La Nina. And so the pattern ended up looking like this, much more anomalous. If I just jump back, even without like comparing the trough to ridge pattern, if I just compare it to last winter, notice how like much flatter the pattern is versus 22 to 23. It's much more undulating because we had that much stronger La Nina and that less temperature difference. And that undulation ended up working strangely in favor. We had a Aleutian high much to the south, a negative PNA pattern. We're just talking about a big trough across the western U.S. And then we were warm east and wet in between. So that's kind of again, Eric said this yesterday, every La Nina is different. And not just because, the La Nina helps us, but not that much with respect to the forecast. December to February 22 to 23, very wet in California, as we talked about. Strangely, we were drier. In the Pacific Northwest, usually it's the opposite sign for La Nina. Wetter in the middle part of the country. This isn't, totally unheard of for La Nina. And then a little bit of drought concerns over along these coastal regions. So this area here doesn't look too different from La Nina, but that's totally reversed, which is why La Nina can be so frustrating. Temperature-wise, much cooler in the west, much warmer in the east. So 22 to 23, not necessarily an analog, just shows you how different each La Nina can be. So again, reorient ourselves to right now, where we're sea surface temperatures earlier this week, October 14th. Doesn't look a lot like 22 to 23, which is why I'm not calling it an analog now. But we do have the weak La Nina. We've actually started to cool off the waters a little bit here and lead up to where they're likely to get cooler in the next 10 to 15 days. And we've seen a pretty appreciable cool down in the waters near Japan, where they're much, much warmer this summer. We also have a lot of warmth over here in the West Pacific and Indonesia. All this warmth in contrast to the cooler waters here is something that we're going to keep an eye on for this winter. And I'm going to explain that in just a second. Now, we're naturally warmer here versus here in these La Nina years, so that holds up. But there's a lot of warmth west versus east that could play a role in winter. Now, if we look at the 7-day change in those sea surface temperatures, what's the trend, at least over the 7 days? Well, I mentioned, look at the Northwest Pacific, how much cooler we've gotten here. We're getting cooler off the west coast here. La Nina, I can't tell one way or the other if one of these colors is winning out, so let's call La Nina flat over the last maybe 7 to 10 days. And we're generally warmer here in the West Pacific and Indonesia. Now, another pattern I want to talk about with respect to winter, because it played a role last winter, is something we call the Tropical Northern Hemisphere pattern, or the TNH. Now, the quick skinny on this as it relates to winter is when this pattern is positive, we tend to get a very deep Hudson Bay trough. That tends to help the lake effect snow season. We tend to get colder air moving into the Midwest, the northern plains. We tend to be drier over here in like Florida, near the Bahamas and Cuba. And we tend to have these big ridges off the western U.S., which prevent a lot of precipitation from getting into the west. Now, predictably, okay, where were we at last winter, where we were generally drier across California, even parts of the west? We were colder across the northern plains at times and into the central U.S. Our TNH pattern last year was slightly positive, and it got more positive as we went through winter. Now, it's almost impossible to see here. Now, if we go and look at 22 to 23, where we were much wetter in the west, at least for California, we actually started out negative before going positive. If we compare to like 2013 to 14, which was much drier for the western U.S., even all the way up through like Oregon, California, Washington, that year had a much more positive TNH pattern where we were colder in parts of the east. So it is one thing. It's another thing that we look at. If this goes way positive, that kind of forecast similarity to last year is going to increase. I'm going to bring up that example. We were very positive in 13 and 14, because going into December of 13, we were warm in the West Pacific, generally cooler. And the East Pacific, we actually had a very weak to non-existent La Nina, and not much to say about the North Pacific despite some warmth here. And we ended up just having, again, a lot of cool air here, not a lot of temperature contrast with the Northeast Pacific, a lot of warmth here. And so you had the jet stream flowing here and then getting very migratory, very variable here. And what that ended up causing for the 13 and 14 winter was a large ridge across the west. With respect to temperatures, very, very cold winter. We had the large ridge across the west, naturally dove down into a trough in the east without that variable jet stream. And so again, not necessarily an analog to this winter, but something I'm watching for. If we start out in the early part of the year with a positive tropical northern hemisphere pattern similar to 2014 or similar to 24-25, my expectation for like a cooler, more variable winter in the central U.S. is going to go up. And perhaps my concern for the West and California is going to go up as well. One thing to keep an eye on. I do want to give a shout out. The tropical northern hemisphere pattern took a while, weeks for me to start to get my head around. And Eric Webb on Twitter or X is a great follow if you want to understand more about these kind of seasonal teleconnections. I think his handle is Weber Weather, but if you just search anything like that, he's going to come up, I'm sure. And so that's one thing I'm keeping an eye on. Let's see. I also went back and looked at all the the winters where we had that positive tropical northern hemisphere pattern. So this would be 17-18, 24-25, I mentioned last winter, a decent analog, 13-14, we just talked about that one. And with respect to temperature, much cooler in this area here, warm in the southwest, warmer in the southeast. What about precipitation? Much drier in the west. Wetter in the eastern Corn Belt, wetter along the Ohio River Valley, middle Mississippi Valley, but drier concerns across the Gulf Coast, even into the southern plains. Eric mentioned that this is showing up in a lot of those seasonal forecasts, even getting into spring. Like, is this going to stretch all the way across here? Because if we build drought into here in winter, December through February, and that starts to bleed into February, March, April, that's going to increase drought concern to the areas to the north. Drought often spreads south to north in this area. So we'll have to watch this closely as we go into the new year. Now, this is just an analog for the TNH pattern. We'll have to see where that goes in December. Again, I think if it starts that way in December, it could be something that we're going to hold on to all winter and starts to give us a benchmark for where we think we're going to go. Now, the seasonal forecasts are a little bit more mixed. There is some similarities with the ECMWF, December, January, February in the eastern U.S., drier here along the Gulf Coast states. In fact, this analog isn't doing a bad job. Drier here across the southern plains with that corridor of wetness in the eastern Corn Belt, middle Mississippi Valley. What's different, however, is we're wetter here in the Pacific Northwest. We're actually wetter for the Sierra Nevadas too, strangely, from this ECMWF forecast that came out a few days ago. Drier along at least the coast of California, but not as dry through Arizona and like New Mexico. We're on the drier side of the precipitation contour here, but like, I don't know, go back to, we talked about the last winter here as an analog. We were much drier in this area here. So the ECMWF forecast right now shows, I think, a bit better jet stream flow getting further south. In fact, if we just look at the temperature forecast, not as cold maybe in the central part of the country, cooler in the north, jet stream diving down like this. And this is very La Nina-like from the ECMWF right now. If we take the 500 millibar height forecast from that same seasonal model out to January of 2026, what I don't see here, and what's not likely to show up always anyway on these seasonal models, is this kind of wild undulating jet stream pattern. What I mean by that is we have decent flow out of the Pacific that makes sense with the West Pacific warm pool. I can tell that by these tight contours here in the 500 millibar height pattern. It's breaking into some sort of ridge here in the west. We talked about that as a likelihood given the weak La Nina. The location of that is critical. If we get this crazy undulating jet stream, like we saw in 22 to 23, and that breaks wildly like that, well, we could go gangbusters in California. I don't see that potential here. I think it's going to break into some sort of ridge here, maybe into a trough here across the west, being better precipitation this quarter here, maybe sneaking into California at times. But I'm also not seeing this pattern where, okay, we have a wild undulating jet stream, we're going to break into a trough here, and then crash, down into these very cold Midwestern or East U.S. winters like the tropical Northern Hemisphere analogs did. Let's see if I can pull those up quickly. Something like this from 13 and 14. I'm seeing something a little bit more mixed from these long-range forecasts with maybe a trough here and better support for ridging here. The only thing I'm seeing decent confidence on between all these different forecast techniques is maybe that drought in this area of the southeastern. I understand I'm drawing a very small portion of this map, but this corridor here, how far is this going to come over and maybe mix with the southern plains drought? In fact, if we just look at where we're concerned about some of this drought now, where is it developing now? That's often kind of a good measure where it's going to be in the future. These areas here, there's some support in the long range that these droughts continue to develop through winter, so we'll have to watch that. Another kind of critical piece of this is where are we at with La Nina? When is it going to transition out of La Nina? We're actually a little bit, we're like here in the middle of October. We're near the bottom, actually, strangely, of these forecasts. Our La Nina index right now, or our El Nino INSO index, 3.4, we're down at -1 Celsius, at least for 3.4, a little bit bigger. We've actually been down there since like the end of September, getting into October. We've kind of hovered down there. We haven't really moved in one direction or the other. We just saw that with the 7-day change in sea surface temperatures. So we're now down here. Are we going to stay on the bottom side of this forecast envelope, or does that just mean it's peaking early and we're going to start coming up even quicker and maybe getting into an El Nino discussion? I understand I'm not answering the question that I'm posing, but that's because I can't. These seasonal forecasts just aren't good enough. You heard the same from Eric yesterday. I'm going to show you a bunch of slides and not give you a firm answer. But I am watching that tropical northern hemisphere pattern. If we see that develop in December, I think we know we're going to have a pretty similar winter to last year, but there's some differences to expect, I think, with the West, with maybe less concern, at least for myself right now, for California. We'll have to watch. And then as we get into the new year, are we going to see that southeast drought materialize? Because there seems to be better support for that in the long range, in the seasonal, along with persistence. What I mean by that is you're starting to check a lot of boxes, that a lot of the seasonal models are picking up on it. It makes sense with the historical analogs that we pulled up, and we're seeing the drought develop there right now. So just checking a lot of boxes is concerning as we get out into the forecast. And we'll have to see where we go from there. Potentially a El Nino event in 2026, which would throw a wrench into things as well. And last thing I'll mention before I wrap up here, because I know I've gone on a long time, is we'll have to keep an eye on that hurricane next week if it can get into the Caribbean. Eric, we'll talk with you all on Friday. If you made it to the end of the video today, appreciate you watching.